So chapter 5, text 16. Chapter 5, text 16. When, however, one is enlightened with the knowledge by which nescience is destroyed, then his knowledge reveals everything, as the sun lights up everything in the daytime. However, when one is enlightened with the knowledge by which nescience is destroyed, then that knowledge reveals everything, as the sun lights up everything in the daytime. It's a very powerful analogy which is used. The analogy of the sun here. And this usage of the sun as being analogous to God or truth or goodness has a long history. There's this Surya Namaskar, sun salutations, that was made up in 1908. It's a squat and a push-up. They just try and make it cool by giving it a fancy Sanskrit name and pretending it's super old. Surya Namaskar, in terms of its origin, has more in common with Indian wrestling than it does with yoga. There's the dund. Dund means stick, that's a push-up. And then the baituk. Baituk is a squat. And that's what Surya Namaskar is. It is literally a burpee with a fancy name. It was invented in 1908 by the Maharaj Vaund, who was an Indian freedom fighter and who wanted the Indian people to stop being so weak and become more masculine and toughen up so they could fight with the British. That said, sometimes when yoga-ish people are trying to validate Surya Namaskar, they point back to the fact that Surya Namaskar, respects to the sun, are there in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest Sanskrit text in the world and the oldest continually practiced religious text, and a very old piece of literature. By any measure. There were older religious texts, but nobody knows what to do with them, and they're, practically speaking, impractical in that the tradition which attended to them died out. Sometimes it gets recreated. You get like this Neo-Egyptian spirituality, and but it's just, people just pick and choose and make stuff up. Like they tried to make a Kemetic yoga in the 60s and 70s. It was supposed to be based on Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it's just a bunch of people sitting around looking like they're doing Egyptian poses, and you get this. There's no causal dispositional relationship. They just took some images and then took the yoga tradition and tried to syncretistically just kind of hack them together, like you might try and stick an ear into a nostril or something like that. It just wasn't made to go. It just doesn't fit. So when you try to recreate these old religions that died out, it's very, very difficult to do. Hinduism has the honor of being the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. And so from the time of the Vedas up until now, the Hindus never stopped using those literatures. And so you have a systematic, step-by-step, incremental evolution of a tradition without it ever being broken. And that's important, because when you look, like when I look at manuals on how to do puja, worship, ritual worship, they never tell you how to actually do the worship. They tell you how to do the worship if you've been taught by somebody in real life how to do the worship. Everything's abridged. It's abridged because it's assumed you have a teacher teaching you the specifics of the movement that goes on. And so they give you bits and pieces and even an outline. But the outline is always made to be used with a living teacher who then fills in the blank and keeps the tradition alive. Does that make sense? The bona fide, the credentials of our system of worship are readily available when you examine the ancient texts that they derive from. You can see, oh, this is what they're talking about. But if you just read what they're talking about, you would never get to this. Like if somebody taught you how to chant Hare Krishna and Japa, and then you went and read an old manual that spoke about chanting japa, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's what we're doing. But if you just read the old manual and they talked about, murmuring mantras and this and that, you wouldn't really know what to do. And sometimes you meet people who never met the devotees. They just read about us in books, and they have all sorts of weird ways in which they interpret what's stated in our text because they've been devoid of that living touch, what Prabhupada called a personal touch. Does that make sense? It's an interesting thing. And I have so much experience of this because I'm, extremely well versed in our system of worship, and also well versed in the history of our worship. And I learned about our system of worship before I learned about our history. And when I went back and read the history, I was like, wow, this is amazing how well it was preserved. Oh, and it's like, it's all so crystal clear. But then if I just do a thought experiment and imagine myself being divorced from that tradition and just reading it in the book, it doesn't make any sense. Plus, sometimes you throw funky stuff in the book just to mess with people and to keep outsiders out. For instance, there is a Purusha Meda Yajna, a human sacrifice in the Upanishads. But there's no history of it ever having been performed, or of anybody even attempting to perform it. And it becomes very clear when you read the human sacrifice that it's meant to be allegorical, and it's meant to be understood symbolically, and it's meant to be about giving yourself. Does that make sense? There's also something called Atma Samarpana. Arpana means offering. Samarpana means complete offering. And so Atma Samarpana means to offer yourself. And Arpana is used specifically to refer to the ritual offering of an item in ritual worship. So to ritually offer yourself, and it's a term which is used for surrender in our spiritual texts. And so they purposely use the sacrificial language to communicate just how fully you are supposed to give yourself over to God. But if you just read it, you'd think, oh my God, these people were killing humans. Okay, yeah. So Hinduism is the oldest continually practiced religion in the world. And you see when people try to recreate stuff, they just end up making up something new with a slight homage to the original culture. And I'm not even sure if it's really honoring the original culture so much, because probably, like I can imagine if somebody butchered our teachings a millennia from now and came up with something which was totally antagonistic to our actual beliefs, I'd almost just say, just go do your own thing and stop trying to authenticate what you're doing by using us. Because somehow if people did a long time ago, we think it's cool. Because we don't do the math and realize that there were really stupid people also a long time ago. And really stupid things were popular. I mean, smoking was incredibly popular in this country. Just kind of like at the beginning of my lifetime, it was still extremely popular. And just prior to my lifetime, it was like the cigarette that doctors smoke, the cigarette that nursing mothers smoke. I mean, the cigarette companies were just shameless in their promotion. And really smart people were all participating in that. It took, decades for anybody to finally say the emperor wears no clothes and have it hold water. Slavery, torture, so many things were just normative. Oh, just a minute ago. Women not voting, chattel slavery, treating women as property, passing on your debts to your children. All sorts of ridiculous ideas. I mean, think about, an eternal hell and an all-good, all-powerful God. Think about how incompatible that idea is. That's still popular with about 5 billion people. So the truth value of a claim is not based on its age. Maybe it offers some secondary or tertiary supportive evidence if you can demonstrate that this has been done for a long time. Anyway, Surya Namaskar shows up in the Rig Veda, and so these modern day yogis with a fetish for antiquity, they always say, hey, just see, it's in the Rig Veda. That's what we're doing. But the thing that they don't bother doing, and this is like I said with the syncretism, is they don't bother, the Maharaj of Aund shamelessly wrote about what he was doing with Surya Namaskar. The guy who invented it in 1908. There's a pamphlet that he put together. So it's not like I'm making this stuff up. He owns it. You follow? But this incredible syncretism, this very, very shallow putting together of two things that don't go together. Surya Namaskar is there in the Rig Veda. It's a prayer to the sun. It has nothing whatsoever to do with exercise. So they came up with this cool exercise, and certainly a burpee is a phenomenal exercise. It's a great exercise. It gives you lower and upper body and even some cardio all in one fell swoop. I mean, it's impossible almost to think of a better exercise. That's why they do it in the military and in prison. Two places where you want to, really keep in shape. And so the burpee is a phenomenal exercise, but the Surya Namaskar of the Rig Veda was a prayer. And there was no asana practice or exercise that accompanied it. There's nothing about that. So they just took an exercise, they gave it a fancy Sanskrit name, a process called Sanskritization. And then when you see Surya Namaskar over here in this ancient hoary text, the Rig Veda, this venerated text, you just foolishly don't do the math and they get merged together. Did you know that? Pretty cool, huh? Disturbing and cool all at once. Huh? Yeah, what happens is this. You learn something when you're in kindergarten, or when you're in kindergarten at your yoga studio, and then you assume it's the gospel truth. And then you build your faith on a house of cards, and you don't bother recognizing the real pillars of faith. And then when these very pixie stick thin myths get exposed, it's the experiences of a betrayal of faith and trust. Because then you start to question everything, which is probably a good thing. And then you can look for real evidence and not have everything standing on balsa wood. We're doing some renovation work at my mom's house, and they used particle board for some outside paneling. It's just, you got to be kidding me. No, you never use particle board for outside work. It soaks in the water and swells and loses all of its structural integrity. Plywood is fine, but particle board you might as well use. Yeah, you'd be better off using styrofoam or something like that. At least that has some, what do I want to say, some water repellent attributes. And so sometimes you find something, this is just garbage. Do you want to put whipped cream on garbage? No, you got to throw it out and start from scratch. Okay, so the analogy of the sun is old. It goes back to the Rig Veda with Surya Namaskar. Socrates used the analogy of the sun, or at least Plato did. Everything we know about Socrates, who was Plato's guru, comes from Plato. So he'll say, my master said this. You never know, but it's the best we got. There was a person named Socrates. He's well attested to enough, and so, anyway, there's the analogy of the sun. Socrates had like 3 major analogies that he used to teach. Analogies are incredibly good didactic teaching tools. They're how you move from what you know to what you don't know, and you compare the unknown to the known. That's why analogies in Sanskrit are called Shaka, Chandra, Nyaya, or the logic of the moon and the branches. If I'm having a conversation with Jacob, and I say, Jacob, look at the moon, it's so beautiful. And Jacob goes, where is it? I can't see it. And I go, oh, you see that tree over there? Look in between the branches. And he goes, oh, there it is. So, Shaka, branches, Chandra, moon, Nyaya, logic. The logic of the moon and the branches. So, just like, for instance, the moon, by the way, is called Shashank in Sanskrit, which means rabbit-marked. You have to, somebody has to go and go, here's where the rabbit is. And then you go, oh, there, I can see it now. Because we're so used to seeing a man in the moon in our culture. So then when you see when you hear it's a rabbit mark, somebody has to hold you by the hand and point it out to you and go like this with their fingers, and then you get it. Then you see it. Even if you have some spiritual knowledge, it always comes to you in a cultural medium. The postmodernist attempt to separate knowledge from culture and look at knowledge in a sterilized state, devoid of any cultural trappings, is itself a very historical movement that's extremely recent, that took place in the last 100 years. And so if you have that bend where you're like, I like my knowledge devoid of any culture, like, You're like an American or Western European from the last century. You're like a noob. That's what's going on. That itself is cultural. For most of recorded history, knowledge or wisdom comes down to you through a culture, and you just learn to appreciate the culture and the wisdom that it has, and figure out how to separate the wisdom from the culture and what's essential and what's non-essential, what can be jettisoned, what's the essence of something. Without hating the culture and the process, you actually appreciate the culture. So anyway, the logic of the moon and the branches. The idea is that the branches are close to you. They are something that you can relate to. The moon is something you're having difficulty finding in the sky. The sky's too vast. You don't know where to look. Now you could make a grid with the sky and move your eyes from focal point to focal point. At any one moment in time, we only look at about 5% of what our vision encounters. We think we're looking at a whole room, but we're not. We're actually looking at a very small area, the size of your thumb at arm's length. That's your foveal point. That's where you focus. We see the whole thing in fuzz, and as we move around, we remember what we've looked at. We have incredible memories, but we're actually focused on just a tiny little, it's probably 1/100th less, a tiny little bit at any given time. So the moon is far away, but the tree is a reference point that we know well. So if somebody said, there's a mosquito in the room, and I actually have really good sight. I have 20/10 vision. I can see at 20 feet what most people can see at 10 feet. I just had my vision taught, and I just had my vision that Soza can attest to this. He was the one. He took me to an ophthalmologist who tested me, and they didn't have software that could, it wasn't there on their computer system. They'd never encountered it. I'm seeing thousands of patients. They'd never met anybody with 20/10 vision. And somehow the ophthalmologist got that, he got a sense I was going to maybe get a shine job on my eyes. Lasix. Because although I can see at distance really well, my close-up vision started failing me the last 3 years of my life. I had perfect vision my whole life up until a couple of years ago, and it just started to go away. And so, I got to do this nowadays. And I got to put it away from me, then I can see it better. So I was going to get my eyes messed with, and then he was going to do a shine job on one so I could use my other one to keep it. It was horrible, and I don't want to lose my vision. What I have, I like what I have. And if you start polishing your cornea, it messes with what you have. And I seem to have a genetic good gift for far-off vision. I'm going to keep that, at least until my eyesight gets bad enough where it becomes, a problem. But yeah, if you said to me, I can't see a mosquito at 25 feet, but whatever. My eyesight isn't that good. But let's just say I had whatever it was, 25 vision or something like that. And I could see a mosquito. And I see, you said, there's a mosquito in the room. I'm like, oh my gosh, where is it? And you're like, oh, it's between Garuda's wings. I know Garuda. I know his wings. I know exactly where to look. You take something that's outside of your frame of reference, and you use something within your frame of reference to get your bearing on something outside. Cry out to Krishna like a child cries out for its mother. Sometimes it's a problem. Krishna loves you like a mother and father. Krishna Mata, Krishna Pitta. Krishna's your mother, Krishna's your father. We used to sing this. Hare Krishna devotees 500 years ago, this is recorded, Hare Krishna devotees 500 years ago would walk around and they would knock on doors and they would say, Bhaja Krishna, Bolo Krishna, Kodo Krishna, Shikha, Krishna Mata, Krishna Pitta, Krishna Pranadhan. Bhaja Krishna, worship Krishna, Bolo Krishna, chant Krishna, Kodo Krishna, Shikha, follow Krishna's instruction. Krishna Mata, Krishna's your mother, Krishna Pitta, Krishna's your father, Krishna Pranadhan, Krishna's the treasure of your life. So that was our cold calling, Mormon moment, Jehovah's Witness moment in history. Our predecessors would stroll around West Bengal at the birth of our movement, and they would just talk to people and share this special thing that they were experiencing with people. Share the gospel, the good news. Gospel means good news. So, sometimes it helps. Call out to Krishna like a child crying out for his mother. Sometimes it works against you. Krishna's your mother and father. What if your mother and father were abusive, negligent? Then comparing God to your mother and father might bring up all sorts of negative feelings. Anyway, analogies are incredibly powerful. They're incredibly powerful. David Hume said that everything we have by way of knowledge everything we have in terms of knowledge comes by way of analogy. Because it's all inductive. You start with what you know and you start to build and you start to relate. I mean, just imagine, I know that all of you are conscious, but I have no empirical evidence that you're all conscious. My consciousness has a feature to it that goes beyond behavioral responses. There's something that it feels like to be me and to be conscious. I know that all of you have consciousness, but I can't empirically observe your consciousness because consciousness by its very definition is phenomenological. It's viewed from the first person. It's viewed from the subjective position. You can't objectively view or measure somebody's consciousness. You can view the behaviors that are associated with it, but you can't actually view the consciousness per se. Did you guys follow that? Consciousness is therefore extremely difficult to study systematically and scientifically because by its very definition, it defies third-person explanations, which is really all science has access to. Objective, third-party observation and experiment. But the very nature of the thing being studied can only be experienced by the first person. It's like when you look at, studies for medicine, your epidemiological studies or your lowest level studies where people report what's going on, but then your double-blind tests are way more significant. You follow? But with conscious studies, you can't get around this. That all you have is what somebody reports. Otherwise, you're dealing with behaviors and not consciousness in its own right. You're dealing with the residue or the results of consciousness as opposed to actual consciousness. I might see a red light and stop, but my seeing of the red light is so much more than my stopping of my car. Do you guys follow this? Okay. Everything we learn, we start with ourselves and we build out, at least if you do it right. We have, I think, in many ways, probably the most sophisticated and first of all, we have the most ancient system of hermeneutics on the planet because hermeneutics was first invented by Indians. That's the rules for how to interpret texts. The reason is because they were one of these cultures that saw language as sacred. Much like the Muslims, that's why at the Kaaba in Mecca, you see all those, the calligraphy of the verse of the Quran. They believe God spoke in Arabic. We go back to heaven and speak with God in Arabic. Jews believe that Hebrew is the language of God. That's why the Tetragrammaton is so sacred, and that's why the Hebrew language is learned by all Jews to this day. I mean, Madhuri and Sarah can both read Hebrew. They don't know what it means. It's so important, their language, that they're taught their language in Hebrew school and they're not taught the meaning of the language. I mean, something, but not much. Right? But you can read it, but they don't know what it means. In fact, to become a card-carrying Jew, to be bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, what's the main thing you do?
Read the Torah.
You read a section of the Torah. That's the main ritual. I mean, there's other stuff, but that's the main thing you do. That's the main thing you study for years, is to be able, with proper intonation and pronunciation, read a section of the Torah in front of your tribe, so they can see that you are now a holder of that tradition in a skeletal form. I mean, it's practically speaking poppycock for you guys because you don't know what the words mean. It'd be so much better if they taught you the meaning of the Torah as opposed to just, they got it wrong, in my opinion. I'd rather have the meaning. You can learn the bells and whistles later. But that just shows you how sacred the Torah is. It gets brought out, carried on the heads of the faithful when it's brought out to speak from. The process of commissioning a Torah to be copied is like the biggest thing you can do as a Jew. Is you give money and they make a new copy of the Torah. And the Torah is dressed in silver end caps and silk cloth and carried on the heads, even in Reformed churches. What to speak of the Hasidim who dance and kirtan with the Torah before they read from it, holding it on their heads like a sacred ark. So these cultures, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, they all have sacred language. Because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu spoke in Bangla, we even consider Bengali to be sacred. So much so that we wrote a commentary on the Chaitanya Charitamrita in Sanskrit, just to prove that this text, even though it's written in a vernacular language, is so spiritual. We're going to write a Sanskrit commentary on it as if it was an old Vedic text, just to prove how sacred it is to us. Anyway, Sanskrit is very sacred to us, and we're right up there. I mean, the first hermeneutics, rules for interpreting a text, and fully systematized. And I mean, 2020, I'm trained in hermeneutics. That's what it means to be a devotee in our tradition, is you're trained in how to understand our sacred literature. We're known as, there are different schools of the Veda, we're known as Uttara Mimamsa. Mimamsa means examiners. It's the hermeneutic tradition. We're the Uttara, the later school, that built on the Purva Mimamsa, the earlier school, that was also concerned with how to interpret text. Even for us, we're like, this is the word of God, it's the breath of Vaikuntha, it's the breath of the Lord, it's the wind of Vaikuntha. It's Shabda Brahman, it's Brahman, spirit in sound. The holy name is of the spiritual world. Golokar Premadan Hodinam Sankirtan. Kali Kali Nama Rupa Krishna. Krishna's name is an avatar. So although we have this incredible, detailed theology of sound, a sonic theology, still our hermeneutics say, if a straightforward reading of the text is nonsensical, then you must interpret it. If you say he was born on the Ganga, then you have to understand that to mean he was born on the bank of the Ganga, or on an island in the middle of the Ganga, because it would not be possible to be born on the Ganga. That's an example given by our own tradition. that shows how much importance they placed on things being reasonable and making sense and being available to you as a first-person observer who's then analogously relating to the world and learning from the world from a first-person perspective. Did you follow that? I'll say it one more time to make my point really clear. Our tradition, which is so strong on the words of our text being sacred, so much so that we learn the language. That same tradition understood that ultimately you have to be able to make sense out of what's going on. You have to build on things you know to things you don't know. You have to look at the Garuda Stamba in order to know where the mosquito is. Look through the branch of a tree in order to be able to see the moon. They place such a premium on this that when the direct reading of a text becomes impossible, and it becomes illogical or unreasonable, then at that point you're allowed to interpret it because you have to be able to relate to what it is you're studying and not just believe any fanciful thing which is said. Did you follow that? The Jews actually have this as well. In the Battle of Jericho, it says that the stars came down to fight in the Battle of Jericho. I believe it was David who was fighting in the battle. I'm not sure. But in the Battle of Jericho, none of you know? Just see. It was David.
No, Joshua.
It was Joshua. Thank you for correcting me. So in the Battle of Jericho, it says the stars came down and fought in the Battle of Jericho. And so Jewish rabbinic scholars for thousands of years have said that doesn't mean the stars actually came down and fought. It just means everybody was fighting. Like they were being poetic. And so it's not that we're the only tradition to do this. We're just the first. So we have here an analogy of the sun. And when Jnanena tu tat agyanam yesham nashitam atmana. When the self, for the self whose knowledge is whose ignorance is destroyed by knowledge. Agyan means ignorance. Gyan means knowledge. Jnanena means with knowledge. Nashita means destroyed. Yesham, for them, for the self, atmana, whose ignorance, agyanam, is destroyed, nashitam, by knowledge. Jnanena. For one who that's happened, yesham, tesham, those are called co-relatives. For one who this is done, then for him this is done. If this, then that. And so yesham and tesha means one who, then they. For them, adityavat jnanam, that knowledge is like the sun. Prakashayati tat padam, illuminating the Supreme. Illuminating the Supreme. Jiva Goswami says, when you first teach people about the self, you teach people about the self, instead of, is one of our theologians 5 centuries ago, one of the major framers of our revival movement that took place 5 centuries ago, when everybody was wandering around telling people that Krishna was their mother and father, the theologians who were framing out our tradition around the same time period. He said that if you're in a dark room and you poke a small hole and a ray of the sunlight comes through, and somebody goes, wow, what's that? You go, that's the sun. It's not the sun, but it's your first experience of the sun. And those photons, those rays of the sun, Suryangsa, the rays of the sun, they are the first experience you have of the sun. Similarly, experiencing the soul is your first experience of divinity. Because we are conscious, we are spiritual. And by looking at ourselves as conscious living entities, we begin to then be able to understand God, our Creator. Just by looking at yourself, you can understand your parents are from Latin America. Even if you were raised in the U.S. and you never knew your parents, and you did not do a DNA test, just by looking at yourself and examining yourself, you'd be able to say, oh, I'm from somewhere in Latin America. You would be able to figure out that you're Jewish, as would you. maybe some of us are kind of mixed up. It wouldn't be quite as easy. But we'd start by looking at ourselves, and we understand something about, where we came from. This idea that you start with yourself. Jiva Goswami made this point 5 centuries ago. Same point is made by analogy. Same point is made by Dave Hume. Same point is the core of analogy. You follow this? Anyway, Socrates had this analogy of the sun. You know it? He had 3 major analogies: the analogy of the divided line, the analogy of the sun, and the analogy of the cave. The analogy of the cave is perhaps the most famous. Anyway, the analogy of the sun. Glaucon, Plato's older brother, who was a student of Socrates, who had several conversations with Socrates and Parmenides and other texts. He asked Socrates in the Republic, I believe, he said, what is good? And Socrates says, I can't tell you what good is, but I can tell you about the child of the good, and that's the sun. And he gave this beautiful, multivalent analogy with multiple possible lessons. How even though you have an eye, a faculty of vision, and you have things in the world, you can't see them without the sun. Similarly, without goodness, real knowledge isn't revealed. That knowledge and truth depend on goodness, and that knowledge and truth are related to goodness, but they're not exactly goodness, and goodness is the most valuable thing. And that with virtue, with goodness, everything else comes. It's interesting, St. Augustine mentioned something he called the primacy of will in knowledge. The primacy of will in knowledge. Augustine of Hippo is famous for saying this. That if you want to know something, there has to be some will. There has to be some desire that is the precursor to being able to know something, because you have to be interested in it enough to get in the laboratory and do the experiment. There are many things in life like this that are just not self-evident or available to you for just looking at in a moment, but you have to actually put the time in. And so goodness for Socrates was like a sun that illuminated everything and actually nurtured everything, and that knowledge and truth grew out of the sun, just as plants grew from sunlight. And although they were valuable in and of themselves, they were nourished by and grew from the sun, and in that sense were also derivative. And so knowledge and truth were derivative of the sun. They were dependent on the sun, just as the eye was dependent on the sun. He had this whole kind of elaborate analogy that was developed around the sun. And amazingly, prior to, and in another part of the world, you have the same thing happening in the Gita. That knowledge is like the sun and illuminates everything. We need to thinking about how I might go about explaining our tradition to someone that knew nothing about it, but that was intelligent and trained in logic and trained in philosophy and epistemology, how I might describe our tradition. And my starting point would be to talk about the irreducibility of consciousness. It's not the easiest argument in the world to make. That, you're going to have to sing for your supper, and like any argument, there's two sides to the argument, and you have to master what your interlocutor has to say, and that your debate partner has to say, and you got to master your side of the argument and understand, how to prevail, and you have to become a good rhetorician, and you have to understand how to become persuasive, and you have to think through it and really know it. You have to really know it. But I would start with, because I got to give somebody I'm talking to something that they can immediately relate to. Otherwise, I'm talking about some theology over there, and how do they get from here to there? So where do we start? We start with what you know. Just like Jiva Goswami said, you start with the soul. Just like Krishna does in the Gita, you start with the soul. Actually, I don't know if you guys have ever read like Rene Descartes or the whole mind-body problem, and like idealism, which the world is all mind, or substance dualism versus property dualism, or neutral monism. There's all these different flavors of philosophy, and oftentimes when you read these guys, they just sound like, honestly, they sound like kind of stupid. Like most of the stuff was done a couple of centuries ago or something like that, and so they didn't have all the science that we have now. When you listen to them talk about this mind-body duality, it just seems like they lived in like a weird world, like didn't really like all that exists is the mind, which leads to solipsism, which is like, that you're the only mind that exists, everything else is a figment of your imagination. Who could possibly say that, right? Or there's two totally different substances. There's spirit and there's matter. But then, of course, the question becomes how they interface. But if you actually dig in, what's going on? It's pretty simple. We're conscious, and we're inhabiting a body. And although we can cut our body apart and cut our brains apart, consciousness really defies a material definition. And so for these predecessors, going all the way back to Socrates and Plato and all the way up to today, we're sitting in this world and we're conscious. And there's matter around us. How do those two things fit together? The same thing exists in the world of physics. You have Newtonian physics with its space and mass and time and calculating of velocity and critical mass, etc., etc. And then you have quantum mechanics, which has a whole different set of rules that this stuff follows. This stuff follows a set of rules. Planets, people, big objects. But if you look at this stuff through a microscope, the atoms that make up this stuff have a whole other set of rules. You got the quantum leap, where, electrons are buzzing around and they're disappearing from one place and appearing in another place. And you got the wave particle differentiation and all this stuff. It's so opposite these rules, but it's the same objects looked at through a microscope, a really big microscope, or just looked at through your ordinary sight, and they follow two different sets of rules. That's the mind-body problem in modern-day physics. We got a mind, we got a body, and they appear to be really different, but they're all jammed together. That's the mind-body problem. Does that make sense? So if I had to explain to somebody, I would say, you have free will. If they want to say, no, you don't, well, then you got to know the experiments that prove that you do have free will. You got to be able to debate those. You have a sense of past and future. You have the ability to think about other things. You experience. There's something that's like to be you. You have experiences. You are conscious. Chemicals do not appear to possess consciousness. There's something called panpsychism, which is actually kind of gaining some popularity these days, and it's come back as a proto-panpsychism. They always throw proto in front of stuff and try and regurgitate it every few decades. Do the same thing with languages. And so we wake up in this world and we're conscious, and we have thoughts about other people, and we have free will, and we feel emotions and pain, and we can become pensive. We can think about thinking. And there's something that's like to be us. There's something that's like to be us. That's based on a guy named Thomas Nagel, who wrote a paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat. It's kind of a very, very seminal paper in this regard, in philosophy. It was written in the early 70s. And for people, really smart people, all throughout history, up till today, the idea that chemicals at some point become conscious is circular reasoning. It's assuming what it is you're trying to prove. It offers no evidence of why that would occur. It would be perfectly reasonable if all of the chemicals that made us up just went on without us being conscious. It would actually be able to make us all way more efficient. Our consciousness becomes really problematic in many ways for our survival. We can look and we can see, to the best of our ability to investigate it, some things aren't conscious, and other things are partially conscious, and some things are fully conscious. And when we look at the chemical world, governed as it is by physics, we don't find matter becoming conscious. We find that consciousness defies a mechanistic description where it becomes a derivative, secondary trait of matter, which can be reduced to more primitive states. We simply don't find that in nature. We don't even find that in the brain. We've gotten really good at showing relationships between certain behaviors and certain thoughts in part of the brain, but relation does not prove causation. And there's no evidence to suggest that these things are emanating from chemical reactions. We can even show how the light goes into your occipital nerve and interfaces with your brain, but then you have a thought about that thing that you're looking at. We have thoughts. Our thoughts reach out and touch the world. And there is no chemical interaction that connects us to the things that we're thinking about. You can show how the light goes in, but not how the thought goes out. In this way, consciousness, at least to my mind, has features that are basic to it that I can measure immediately, phenomenologically, in the first person. It's as empirical gets, to be quite honest, but because it's in the first person. But matter simply does not possess those attributes. Hey, Narayan, stop. Narayan, stop telling me about your ironing board. Help me out here. I think I created a monster. Okay, there we go. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I would start with consciousness and the irreducibility of consciousness. And then we got to start to ask, well, where does consciousness come from? And I'd start to use... Okay, guys, we're going to call it thank you so very much for your kind attention. Hare Krishna.